So we turn to what really generated the most excitement and the most controversy, and that was multi-employer bargaining. Not something we heard a lot about before the election, but we heard a huge amount after the election. What I would like to do, I mean, it's quite complex, it's quite new, it's subtle, but it's wide-ranging, and as I said, and significant. The way the legislation handles it is that it utilises, renames and expands the existing enterprise bargaining streams, but in so doing it creates a new emphasis on multi-employer bargaining, or single interest bargaining as it's called. The terms are used interchangeably, away from what we are more familiar with, which is single enterprise bargaining. And that the three sort of streams, as I said, sort of tacking on and building on the existing regimes, which we're reasonably familiar with, take and sort of jump out in these new directions to shepherd in multi-employer bargaining as the preferred way of doing things. There's a new concept called single interest employer authorisations, which largely supplant what we're used to in single enterprise agreements, which still can exist, and there's good reason to renew our focus on those, and I'll come back to those. The second thing I just needed to say, something called supported bargaining replaces the low-paid bargaining stream for childcare, aged care, disability workers. Not something I want to talk about now, other than to say it still exists, it's just got a new name, but I don't think it would be particularly relevant to this audience. It's very much driven by the Fair Work Commission to get a supported bargaining order. And I have to also mention cooperative workplace bargaining, which replaces the current multi-employer agreement stream that franchisees use where they want it, whether like Subway, they want all their franchisees, they volunteer to go into it. That still exists, now called cooperative workplace bargaining stream. A lot of the problem with this new package actually was all the new vernacular, all the new jargon. But once you sort of unpack that, as I said, it's really a graft of what's already there, but there's a lot of new terminology which I've tried to cut through. So that continues, and of course the government does point out the cooperative workplace bargaining stream is open to small businesses. If they would like to go into a multi-employer bargaining stream or a multi-employer agreement, they can, but it's on a voluntary basis for a small business. So it's treated as an exemption. So what about multi-employer bargaining? Well, sorry, before I get to that, I will need to, and I will talk about the state of play for single enterprise agreements. Now, they were the driving force of the Fair Work bargaining structure, and before that, it really came in. Kelty put that new emphasis on enterprise bargaining in place of wide-ranging, centralised, award-based bargaining, put that on the road in the early 90s. So that's been a bedrock of our, and we had 30 to 40% of employees were covered by enterprise agreements. That was how wages were to be kept up and to be growing and to keep pace. Now it's largely falling into disrepair and disuse. We have a figure now whereas it used to be 30, 40%, now only 15% of employees are subject to enterprise agreements that are current. The preferred mode now is let your old enterprise agreement expire, because then you've got the structure, pay common law, or pay wage increases by common law, otherwise you'll lose your staff, but don't get into fresh negotiations with unions, with new logs of claims and all the rest of it. It's a bit of a stalemate, essentially. So what this package is designed to do is to kickstart that 15% back up to 30 and 40%, get people bargaining again. New enterprise agreements have essentially gone stale. Nothing's happening. And that's a great concern to the union movement, because that's their bread and butter, that's their work. And in certainly in their world, that is how you get wages going. You're always going to get your minimum wage increases, which have been, I think it was about 6.5% last year, and the year before, a bit of a pause during COVID, but where real wage growth comes is through enterprise agreements. And there's been a lot of talk about 5 + 5 + 5 for the next 3 years. That's how you get wages kick-started, in the words of our current Workplace Relations Minister, Tony Burke. So you only have to get into the multi-employer world, multi-employer bargaining world, if you don't deal with your single enterprise agreement. But to kickstart that, whereas at the moment the employer completely controlled the commencement of bargaining, absent a 51% workplace determination in favour of bargaining, now the union can just trigger it by serving a notice saying you've got to bargain, you've got an enterprise agreement, or perhaps you haven't got one, but we've got members and we want to bargain a new agreement or a renewal of the existing agreement. It's not for the employer to sort of now hold up their hands and say, well, good luck with that, show us your 51%. That the piece of paper will be sufficient, provided that the proposed agreement the union want to bargain on is a single enterprise agreement that's past its nominal expiry date, which most of them out there have now. No more than 5 years has expired since the agreement expired. The proposed agreement covers the same workforce and that they're not already in the multi-employer bargaining stream. So what is the upshot for employers given the new rules of the game in relation to their existing single enterprise agreements? Well, as I said, no need for the 51%. You can't sit on your hands any longer. And if those requirements, the requirements above are met, which is simply really like what most employers would be familiar with, the idea of serving a notice of representational rights to employees to be affected by bargaining, the union can now essentially do that to the employer. It's just a piece of paper. So employers are required then to bargain, subject to good faith bargaining obligations and protected industrial action if it gets to that, but I still think that will be fairly rare. This is more attractive than it may appear, as a single enterprise agreement in force will protect an enterprise from being roped into multi-employer bargaining. We're going to hear a lot more about roping. Roping used to refer to awards. You had to be roped to an award prior to modern awards, which apply to everyone across industry. Roping will now be about the union's got an enterprise agreement against one enterprise. What the union or that employer might want to do is then rope in its competitors in a similar position. That's what roping will now mean. We're going to hear a lot more about roping, and that's literally what it is. You can only do it through a commission order, and I'll talk about how a commission order comes about. But that was the old way with roping under award.